Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents the U.S. Army's first, last, and only all-black Rangers, the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, in the Korean War, 1950 to 1951. By Edward L. Posey, Master Sergeant, retired. Narrated by Sean Crisden. Forward. This book covers the first 8 months of the 2nd Airborne Ranger Company's experiences during the Korean conflict. It complements the histories of the 3rd and 4th Ranger Companies, which were both all-white, by telling the stories of an all-black unit. There are marked similarities, but some race-specific differences between the Ranger Companies, which makes this book significant to the history of African Americans in military service. The U.S. Army's first, last, and only all-black Rangers, 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, in Korea, 1950 to 1951, gives a general unit history of the 2nd Airborne Ranger Company's combat experiences in Korea. It records an important chapter in the Korean War. It begins with the first year of the war and goes on to describe in great detail the test of American leadership, resources, training incompatibility, and inadequacies of the United States effort in Korea. It also examines the special problems posed to the fighting army during the months of stalemate in the summer of 1951. Like the stories of other Rangers who served in Korea, this book emphasizes the limitations imposed by terrain and weather on the fighting capabilities of the troops. For those in the profession of military history, the operations of the 2nd Ranger Company are described in careful detail to provide a vivid description of the application of the principles of war. This book is going to the printer more than 50 years after the end of the Korean War. It emphasizes the contributions of African Americans who served during the Korean era. It is important to study carefully such a recent and invaluable example of an American all-black Ranger Company that performed superbly against many odds. I encourage military and civilian students and veterans alike to take advantage of this insightful journey into the lives of those African Americans who made great sacrifices when America was in need. William E. Ward, General, Commander, United States Africa Command. Preface. The 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, sometimes referred to in this book as 2nd Ranger Company or 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, has the distinction of being the first, last, and only all-black Ranger unit. First, because Ranger training had never before been offered to black soldiers. Last, because in late 1951, after several months of intense combat, 2nd Ranger Company and all other Airborne Ranger Infantry Companies were inactivated. Only because that was how it happened. One group of elite soldiers trained, fought, and was disbanded, but not before leaving behind a legacy of heroism and honor. Prior to the Korean War, it was commonly thought that blacks would not fight if placed in combat situations, and white soldiers would not follow the orders of black officers. Only through the exemplary performance of soldiers, such as the Buffaloes of the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy in World War II, did we begin to dispel these myths. After Executive Order 9981, which was signed into law on the 26th of July, 1948, by President Harry S. Truman to desegregate the American military, the Army was the last of our services to comply. In 1950, during the 2nd Ranger Company's training at Fort Benning, and in 1951, while in Korea, the black soldiers of the 2nd Ranger Company were very much living 2 lives. One as highly trained, respected members of the elite Ranger forces, and another as black servicemen, subject to the laws of segregation. In combat, all soldiers were colorblind. Hospitals and aid stations treated everyone together, and the rules of segregation that dominated civilian situations at home did not exist. Stateside, these were years of uncertainty, racial tension, and a sense of inevitable, lasting changes to come. But unless you were overseas, under fire, and in close combat, the concepts of respect, racial equality, and civil rights often did not apply. Nonetheless, segregation was costly and inefficient for the military, particularly during a time when armed forces manpower was needed. When Rangers from 2nd Ranger Company boarded a plane for their historic combat jump at Munsan-ni, One ranger made the comment that it took the Chinese to integrate the American Army. And he was right. Chinese intervention in Korea was a wake-up call for Army integration. There was a realization that if we did not use black troops, we could lose this war. The changes necessitated by desegregation did not come easily and were accompanied by many awkward moments. Even over 50 years after the inactivation of the Ranger companies, the authors and those Rangers who aided them in the completion of this book found desegregation difficult to process. Nonetheless, the events that shaped America's first, last, and only all-black Ranger unit are described from its activation in 1950 to inactivation in August 1951, as compiled by the unit's executive officer and 2 sergeants, with help from many 2nd Airborne Rangers who served alongside the authors. In the military, the old World War II policy that no black officer would command white personnel, maintained by the 92nd Infantry Division, contributed to racial tension. But there also were other times when white soldiers turned against bigotry and stood with blacks to demand equality. For example, Lieutenant Richard E. Robinson, the only black in the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, RCT, got there because the white officer paratroopers of his officer candidate class, who were signaled out to join the 187th Airborne RCT, said they would not go without him. Major Joe Jenkins, S1 of the 187th, offered the opportunity to all of the officers except Robinson, because no colored soldiers were in the 11th Airborne Division. But because the rest refused to go without Robinson, on the 20th of October 1950, when the 187th RCT jumped at Suktan, Korea, Robinson became the first black paratrooper in the history of the U.S. Army to make a combat jump. Yet, nearly a decade after Black Mess Attendant Dory Miller, U.S. Navy, valiantly fired from the deck of the USS West Virginia while the ship was under attack in Pearl Harbor, using a machine gun he could not have trained officially to use, white soldiers and prominent military figures continued to question whether blacks had the courage and desire to perform ground combat duty, to fight for their country. Members of the 2nd Ranger Company did, and this book has been written to record those events and commemorate their place in history. The Korean War has been called the Forgotten War, and in many ways it would be comforting to forget segregation and the efforts that were required to desegregate the military as well. But segregation was not just a dream. It is a part of American history, and should neither be forgotten nor overemphasized. Unless we show our descendants how to see beyond the past, racism will remain, and true equality, in which all individuals are treated without preference or prejudice, will never be achieved. After the Korean War, many of the 2nd Airborne Rangers decided that they had found a home in the Army. Some took their Ranger expertise to a different branch of service, such as James Taylor, Navy SEAL, or James Allen, Roland Hodge, and William Rhodes, U.S. Air Force. But in addition to those few, 64 of 140 Rangers who served in the 2nd Ranger Company from 1950 to 1951 retired from the military after 20 years of service. Approximately 15 Rangers later became officers. This was an exceptional company of men. For many, their Korean War experiences left a lasting impression that would shape their lives. Likewise, their experience in the first, last, and only all-black Ranger unit left a lasting impression on the military. Master Sergeant Edward L. Posey, U.S. Army, retired. Part 1. The soldiers of the all-black 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, Airborne, like other black units, were nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers. There's more than one explanation of how the nickname came to be, but a commonly accepted account is that sometime around 1870, the 10th Cavalry Regiment was given this nickname by the Cheyenne Indians, who saw a similarity between the curly hair and dark skin of the soldiers and the buffalo. The nickname gradually came into usage whenever referring to any black soldier fighting the Plains Indians, and was so popular among the members of the 10th Cavalry that they adopted the figure of a buffalo as a prominent feature of their regimental crest. During World War I, the soldiers of the 92nd Division adopted the nickname, and the unit was called the Buffalo Division. Each member wore a shoulder patch on his uniform adorned with the solitary figure of a black buffalo. In 1942, the 92nd Division kept the nickname and apparently acquired a live young buffalo as a mascot. In 1950, throughout their training days at Fort Benning, Georgia, and before the Buffalo Rangers who were to fight in Korea went overseas, Buffalo was a term of respect. In it, there was solidarity. We are Rangers, and we carry the traditions of earlier Buffalo soldiers. We are strong, we are resilient, and we are united to destroy the enemy. Introduction. At the end of World War II, Korea was divided into two parts along the 38th parallel as a temporary solution until a unified Korea could govern itself. By 1948, Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea had each established independent governments. The Korean War erupted on June 25, 1950, when North Korean combat troops of the Korean People's Army, KPA, crossed the 38th parallel on the peninsula in eastern Asia. After the North Korean attack, President Harry S. Truman immediately committed U.S. forces to face the North Korean challenge. And so it was that just 5 years after World War II ended, the United States again found itself involved in a war halfway around the world with a people they had never met. When the armed forces of the United States joined the Republic of Korea and 21 other countries to fight together under the United Nations banner against Communist North Korea and later China, it was in the wake of a rapid military drawdown of American forces after World War II. Unprepared to meet any new or emerging national security threats, American forces were plagued with deficiencies in personnel, equipment, training, and technology. Furthermore, World War II veterans and their families were ready for the peace and tranquility of civilian life. The GI Bill and the post-war economic boom offered many white veterans opportunities in civilian life they never before had imagined. Black veterans also were able to take advantage of education and home ownership. Re-enlisting to fight another war in a faraway land held little appeal for most American veterans. Blacks in the agrarian South, however, were left with an uncertain financial future when the country's new economic prosperity caused farm opportunities to decrease. For many blacks who previously had known only a rural life, the Army was their ticket out. Faced with limited economic opportunities, they viewed the Army as a way to receive training, gain experience, and travel. These men and women were an ideal new resource for the country's defense. Many blacks saw America's campaign against communism in Korea as an opportunity to challenge segregation in the military. Under pressure from civil rights political leaders and Senator Hubert Humphrey, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, which called for equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origins. The order was to be implemented as rapidly as possible, having due regard to the time required to effectuate any necessary changes without impairing efficiency or morale. Although the word desegregation did not appear in the executive order, and the means by which each military service should accomplish racial equality in the armed forces was not specified, this document served as the basis for racial integration in America's armed forces. It is important to place segregation in the context of the times. When World War II began, blacks in the Army and Navy held only menial positions. There were no blacks in the Air Corps, what later became our Air Force, and no blacks in the Marine Corps. Throughout the 1940s, racial discrimination, prejudice, and bigotry were common and, sadly, often accepted in our nation and our military. Desegregation was the first step toward racial equality. For our armed forces, this important step was taken during the Korean War. Unfortunately, since Executive Order 9981 neither specified a means to accomplish integration nor a timetable for full desegregation, black servicemen often trained, worked, and lived in segregated settings during the Korean War. Although the Air Force led the way with a plan for racial integration in January 1949, and in 1950 adhered to a racial integration policy that placed each person in a position solely on the basis of aptitude, Desegregation was a slow, multi-year process throughout all of the other branches of American military service. Both the Army and the Marine Corps entered the Korean War with racially segregated forces. By October 1951, the Army had begun the work of integrating its units, which would take 3 years to complete. Not until October 31, 1954, would the Army report that no segregated units remained in its ranks. Although some, like the members of the 2nd Ranger Company, Airborne, were allowed to train for equal opportunities, they were still treated differently and remained segregated in an all-black unit. Of the United States' 9 major wars, the Korean War is the least remembered. Known as a brutal test of survival in a hostile land filled with hardships caused by its hilly terrain and harsh weather conditions, the Korean War was America's first real experience with guerrilla tactics. 6 million American men and women served in Korea as soldiers, nurses, clerks, chaplains, rangers, and combat and support staff. Blacks comprised about 8% of total U.S. military manpower and were represented in all combat and combat service elements. Total black casualties in Korea were heavy, with estimates of more than 5,000 killed in combat, of which 13 were members of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company. Numerous blacks were awarded medals, including the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Bronze Star. 4 members of the 2nd Ranger Company, Captain Warren Allen, 1996, Major James C. Queen, 1994, Master Sergeant Edward Posey, 2002, and Chief Warrant Officer 4 Cleveland Valerie, 2005, were inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame for heroic actions during combat. The 2nd Ranger Company was awarded the Combat Infantry Streamer, a commendation awarded to units receiving more than 65% of casualties in a particular engagement with the enemy. For their courage and valor, members of the 2nd Ranger Company also received the Combat Infantry Badge or Combat Medical Badge. Others earned the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and Silver Star. This book has provided the 2nd Ranger Company's unit history by sharing its wartime experiences, as seen largely through the eyes of Major James C. Queen, an officer, and Sergeant First Class William Weathersby and Master Sergeant Edward L. Posey, both enlisted men. Their stories of valor, and many more by several other Rangers, are punctuated by the inequalities routinely encountered by black soldiers in the years leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. Their experiences are important. They demonstrated with great force and clarity that black soldiers could and would fight for their country with as much courage and ability as white soldiers. They also served as a snapshot in time of our nation and culture during a turning point in American civil rights. Constance A. Burns, B.S., M.A., Specialist in Minorities in Military History, Department of the Army, U.S. Army Center of Military History, Fort Leslie J. McNair, Washington, D.C. Chapter 1. Training at Benning. Training of Ranger-type units was to begin at Fort Benning at the earliest possible date. The target date was set for October 1, 1950, with a tentative training period of 6 weeks. The implementing orders called for formation of a headquarters detachment and 4 Ranger Infantry Companies, Airborne. Requests went out for volunteers who were willing to accept extremely hazardous duty in the combat zone in the Far East. www.ranger.org/html/korea_history.html. Sometime around the 25th of September, 1950, rumors started circulating around Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that a Ranger recruiting team was on base looking for a few good triple volunteers, soldiers who had volunteered for the Army, the Airborne, and to see combat as a Ranger. Triple volunteers committed to 1. A minimum of 3 years of service, because there was no draft in operation at the time, 2. Parachute and glider school that produced 2 sets of wings when satisfactorily completed, and 3. Combat in Korea, which is where all Ranger volunteers were headed. Fort Bragg was the home of the 82nd Airborne Division, a major portion of the United States Strategic Forces. The 82nd Airborne Division was the only combat-ready unit still stateside when the call for Ranger volunteers went out. The 11th ABN was just getting reorganized after returning from Japan and was stripped of personnel to bring the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, ARCT, up to strength in time for the Sukchon and Suncheon jump in October 1950. The main post at Fort Bragg could not hold all of the units assigned to it. The majority of the 82nd was located in the main post area, but upon the reactivation of the 325th Glider Unit, the 325th was moved into the old Recruit Training Center, RTC, located across Highway 24, where non-airborne engineer units and the reception center for personnel newly assigned to Fort Bragg also were housed. The black troops were located in the Spring Lake Cantonment area on the south side of Highway 24, near the small town of Spring Lake. Murchison Road, the other main road leading into Fayetteville, North Carolina, is adjacent to this area and ran through the main black area of the city. It usually took about a day for the official information to come from the main post to the Spring Lake area, and 2 days for information to reach the RTC area. The rumors were usually passed at the division schools because the housing and recreation area on post and in the community were separate but equal. Some of the black troops had regular duty assignments on the main post, and this was another way in which word of the recruitment of blacks for ranger training was disseminated. The main black units in the Spring Lake area were the 3rd Battalion, 505th Infantry Regiment, the 80th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, AAAB, and the 758th Tank Battalion, Airborne. The 758th was kept on jump status and was to provide tank support to the 82nd Airborne Division in case of war. Throughout September 1950, it grew obvious that we were going to be sent overseas, because we were the only unit in the 82nd Airborne that was overstrength. Corporal James Fields, who was recruited from the 80th AAAB, describes a typical Fort Bragg recruitment session as follows. A white officer on a physical training PT stand started to speak as soon as we were assembled. "We are forming the toughest, meanest outfit in the United States Army. I don't know if you will go in by submarine, parachute, or what, but you will be fighting. The unit will be called Rangers. We want volunteers. The line forms to the right." I had to be in the outfit. I knew what Rangers had been in World War II. I had done research on Darby's Rangers, and the post library had information and pictures of the men in the Rangers Battalion. I knew about British commandos, missions carefully planned, split-second timing, hit and run. I gave the interviewing officer such a persuasive spiel that I could not be turned down. I was in. Like Fields, many were apprehensive and excited, but subdued. Orders from division headquarters usually arrived so late to the company at the Spring Lake Cantonment that the normal procedure was, "Hurry up and give me your decision now." That decision sent men from Fort Bragg to Fort Benning in Georgia, where 6 weeks of ranger training began. At that time, the Rangers training at Benning either belonged to the all-white 2nd Ranger Company or the all-black 4th Ranger Company. At Benning's Harmony Church Cantonment area, both units trained together but lived separately. The 2nd and 4th would exchange unit designations on the 13th of November, 1950. From that date until its inactivation on the 1st of August, 1951, the all-black unit was known as the 2nd Ranger Company. The Harmony Church Cantonment area was a small living and training area for Rangers only, at the far southeast corner of the post about 10 miles from the jump towers. It was near the town of Buena Vista. Toward the end of World War II, Harmony Church had been the housing area for the Officer Candidate School, OCS, and the Compass Course areas. The 25th Infantry Regiment was located in Sand Hills, and the Small Arms Ranges and Jump School were in the South Post area. The Black Troops area consisted of the last quadrangle, a small PX, a movie theater, and a barber shop. The bus could go directly to town from Harmony Church or come up to a variety of locations on the main post. The local custom of blacks riding at the rear of the bus prevailed. The only time the Rangers needed to come on post was for range firing and parachute training. The 3rd Infantry Division was trained there before deployment to Korea. The 11th RCT acted as school troops. Physical conditioning and training. The training at Fort Benning was rigorous. The day usually started with a 3 to 5 mile run before breakfast, nicknamed the Airborne Shuffle. Even before entering the mess hall, there was physical training, PT. A pull-up bar was posted over the door to the mess, and only after doing 5 or more pull-ups were you allowed to enter the mess hall. Marching to the training sites with all equipment was routine. The trick of going without a lot of water was learned very early. You put a small pebble under your tongue to stimulate the saliva glands, causing the mouth to stay wet and lessening the need for water. These were skills we would later rely upon on the battlefield. All men assigned to Ranger Training Command were already qualified paratroopers and had passed the standard PT test with a score of at least 300 points. The standard test consisted of 500 points. The average trooper could easily make the 300 points required to pass. The pull-ups were usually the most difficult part of the test. The physical run was no problem, except with a hangover. Very few fell on the runs. Usually the airborne Jody cadence was modified from Airborne all the way with the word Ranger as follows. Platoon Sergeant, Airborne. Platoon reply, Ranger. Platoon Sergeant, all the way. Platoon reply, Ranger. Those of us who had come from Fort Bragg were in good physical condition. Back at Bragg, the troopers of the 3rd Battalion frequently ran about 5 miles down to Pope Field from the Spring Lake area. From October through November, the Rangers conducted familiarization firing of most of the weapons: 45 caliber pistol, carbine, M1 rifle, Browning automatic rifle or BAR, and 45 caliber submachine gun, including a few Russian and Chinese weapons such as the Chinese grenade, which used a pull string. The Rangers moved on to tactical training, starting at the squad and platoon levels. Ranger recruits learned map reading, which included U.S. military maps, foreign maps, and maps of Korea printed by the Japanese when they had occupied the peninsula. Rangers also learned land navigation, night patrol/day patrol methods, interdiction operations, phone and electric power line sabotage, assassination methods, improvised killing, martial arts, hand-to-hand combat and raid procedures, and completed demolition training, water training, and small boat and rubber boat RB-15 training. The training day was usually 12 and sometimes as long as 15 hours. Soldiers got used to walking in their sleep during the long road marches. Sometimes the column would turn, but a sleepwalking ranger would continue walking until he hit a tree or walked into the woodline. Rangers tried to drink enough coffee before march to stay awake, but not so much that they would need to stop, at the risk of being left behind or becoming a skunk attraction. The roughest training problem was a company raid to blow up a big bridge deep in enemy territory. This exercise was held near the town of Buena Vista on the far side of Fort Benning. We must have walked 20 miles that night. There was a real sleepwalker problem that evening. The action started when Lieutenant James Queen hit a bouncing Betty style of trip flare on the bridge just as the charges were set, which gave the alarm. This helped to clear the bridge in record time. We took off down the railroad tracks on the escape route and successfully passed the training exercise. During one of the exhausting 24-hour platoon-size patrols, the 1st platoon commander fell asleep and failed to post adequate security. It just so happened that Colonel John Gibson Van Houten, the Ranger Brigade training commander, came out to check on this training problem in person. He walked through the majority of the platoon area without being challenged. If a mistake like this had happened in combat, the entire platoon could have been killed. So the platoon failed and had to repeat the grueling patrol. When the unit got back to the barracks, Colonel Van Houten called in all of the company officers for a critique. Needless to say, everyone was extremely embarrassed. He ended his critique with an often-heard racial slur, "You people won't fight when you get to Korea." This caused immediate anger among the company officers. All of the previous racism they had experienced seemed to be summed up in this one biting criticism. The innuendo behind the words, "you people," always provoked images and emotions of racism. The officers bit their tongues and offered no excuses, but resolved never to be in such a shameful position again. And it never did happen again. Still, that one mistake left a sting, still not forgotten. The colonel's remarks were never passed on to the men because it was the officers' leadership failure that had allowed this situation to occur. But copies of the first award orders from combat were later sent to Colonel Van Houten as proof that his assessment of the unit's probable conduct during combat had not been accurate. During Ranger training, the word was that the North Koreans were on the run, and the action in Korea was just about over. All of the men would be home for Christmas, and the trainees at Benning would never see combat overseas. Many of us were disappointed. But on the 3rd of November, 1950, the Chinese entered the war.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?